Welcome back, and we're moving straight into the business end of things with the turret. Of course, 3 people will sit up here, the gunner, where I'm seated right now, the commander behind me, and the loader, where the cameraman is currently located. The gunner's position is cozy. I mean, I've been in worse. The seat is adjustable up or down, so you have relatively comfortable ability to meet your eye to the eyepiece. The main optic is a stereoscopic rangefinder. It's got 2 eyepieces, obviously stereoscopic, 2 eyes. The way the stereoscopic rangefinder works is by way of visual acuity, you have a base measurement which it's the distance between the 2 blisters on the outside of the tank, and one of them angles in or out to form a meeting point on the target. So you know what the angle is of the mirror, you know what the base length is of your 2 lines of sight, so therefore by trigonometry you can estimate exactly how far away the target is. Now what you're actually doing is you're aiming a series of V-shaped lines onto your target. It's a process called flying the geese. And as I say, very few people actually had the visual acuity to do this, so the Army effectively dropped it after a while, and they moved to the more common coincidence rangefinder, which works on a very similar premise. Again, the 2 lenses and trigonometry, but instead usually it's 2 different images that get superimposed into one. Obviously ammunition is selected on the left side. Bore sight is only done when obviously if you're bore sighting the equipment before you go into battle. There are lights for night vision, and you can choose the scales you're working off. The actual range estimation is done using this control here. It's a 7.5 magnification. It's graduated out to 5,000 yards. An alternate form of aiming is going to be through the use of the ballistic drive, and this is a much more mechanical process. You simply select your best range estimate in hundreds of yards. You dial it in for your ammunition type, and what this does is it moves the ballistic drive either by twisting here along this axis at add super elevation to the gunner's periscope, or by way of this linkage it does exactly the same thing to the commander's periscope. Now you'll see that the ballistic drive, although it has settings for the main gun ammunition, it doesn't have it for the coaxial. On the periscope itself is a very handy little chart up here. Depending on which machine gun you're going to shoot, caliber 50 or caliber 30, it tells you which mil setting you want for an appropriate range. So for example, you're shooting something at 700 yards using caliber 50, you'll set the mil to 5.5. That should get you more or less on target. Anything more than that, you can probably just adjust off your tracer. Other controls to his front, he's got hydraulic, elevation, depression, and his right hand is the one, I guess I should do it this way. His right hand controls the traverse. A full spin will be about 10 seconds. Pretty fast. Manual backups do exist. He's got a manual drive on his right, simple enough, and a hydraulic pump on his left for raising or lowering the gun. Of course, there is an electrical trigger on the manual backup as well as on the primary control handle. You can see piping all over this thing, so you can only imagine, oh, we got a leak in the hydraulic system. Where is that? We'll find it. The box at the front, a bit of an anachronism. Left gun, main gun, right gun. Of course, there's only 2 guns in here. This is a coaxial and the main. This seems to be a bit of a holdover from an earlier idea when you were going to have a 50 caliber and a 30 caliber coax mounted all at the same time. In actuality, what would happen is that you'd have 1 coax only on the left side, the standard for the loader, and that would usually be the 30 cal. Very rarely ever heard of a 50 being installed, but it could happen should you be inclined that direction. The gun is a 90mm T119E1, later the M36. And there's another example of American confusion. You say M36 90mm gun, you're talking about the gun motor carriage, M36, the Jackson tank destroyer, or you're talking about the gun. It was developed to replace the earlier M3 found on the M36 gun motor carriage. It was a percussion-fired system with an honest-to-God firing pin and cocking handle. For reasons which completely escape me right now, the breech operator's handle is on the right-hand side next to the gunner. So let's say the loader has to extract an unfired round, maybe it's a misfire, he's got to stand behind the breech pretty much in order to open it. Not something you want to be doing when the gun has failed to go boom. At least immediately. If it's a hang fire, you're standing behind the breech and you're trying to reach the operating handle when the gun goes off, not a good day. It comes back about 16 inches, and if you're in that 16 inches, you won't be anymore. Also, to its front, you can see the two marks for the gunner's elevation quadrant. This is used for indirect fire. It looks a little bit like a sextant. What you'll do is got a spirit level in it. You set the estimated, or you set the desired mils for elevation. You place it on the gun breech, and then you elevate or depress so that the spirit bubble is in the level position. Because it's a hydraulic system, max elevation and depression is pretty quick. It's 6 seconds to go from one to the other, elevation being 19 degrees and maximum depression being 5, which by American standards is actually pretty miserable. Although it's a hydraulic system, you see the gun is not actually stabilized. And exactly why, I'm not sure. The US Army went away from stabilizers after the M4, although the M4 stabilizer did actually work if people bothered to use it correctly. That's a long story. You'll find that one online in one of my articles. But for the M26 and then the M46, M47, they abandoned stabilization. They were certainly still looking into it. They were doing all sorts of tests, and the next generation tank was expected to have stabilization, but on this one, sadly no. Maybe it was just a matter of the expediency. Anyway, so that's it for the gunner's position. I've actually been off camera here for most of an hour, taking various snippets, and my legs are still quite comfortable, so I'll put that as a plus for the gunner's seating position on this tank. So next we're going to move back one spot to the TC. So move back up to the TC's seat. Well, TC's position, unfortunately. Although the vehicle itself is operational, the elevation system for the TC seat is not. So what I've done, I just folded it out of the way. But ordinarily, of course, the TC has a little lever on the side, pulls it out, the seat will elevate or depress. The Sietta's got a cupola, it's got 5 basic vision blocks and the telescope, periscope to his front. Now, because of the linkage system between the ballistic drive and his own sighting telescope, the cupola will not rotate. To control, he has a one-hand controller. This will do both traverse and elevation. It's kind of awkward. It's not as easy to use, I don't think, as the more modern joysticks that we use. But it'll certainly get the point across and help the gunner lay onto a target much faster. To his rear, the bustle is primarily filled with 3 things. Firstly, 4 rounds of semi-ready stowage. They are clamped into position with wing nuts to stop the round coming forward and doing nasty things to the commander should there be excessive bumps or should the driver be a little bit hard on the brake. Below it, the AN VRC3 radio system, and in the very far back is a ventilator fan. Of course, you want to leave a little bit of room for air to circulate, and the blower just extracts out the turret roof. I do note a lack of safety guards, and he does seem to be rather close to the gunner, but that's pretty much par for the course for tanks of the era. Outside of that, he doesn't have very much else that he needs to work with inside. There are 2 dome lights inside, one directly on top of the gun and one to his left in between himself and the loader. His other toys are outside. So I'm going to hop up right quick and have a quick look at them. So once you have your head out of the reasonably sized hatch, items on the turret roof. Pintle mount for the caliber 50 machine gun. There's actually a rest here, so when the machine gun is not in operation, you can swing it around, rest the barrel in here. Stops it from swinging around randomly as the tank is bouncing over the terrain. The hatch to his rear is a very, very simple flip up with a very simple locking lever on the end. Just behind that, you see the dome for the ventilator housing. And behind that is the large bustle for the extra stowage, usually bags, personal kit is most likely going to go in the turret. That's it for this side. Now going to hop over to the loader seat. Up top, the loader's hatch is simplicity itself. It is locked in place by a very simple lever. You always want to lock one of these hatches because as you're bouncing around, you don't want it to come up and hit you on the head. And when it comes down, it just simply folds flat on top of you. It's locked by a very simple sliding lock. A little bit of padding there to protect your head once you're inside. To its front, the fixed forward-facing periscope has a bush guard. And the loader also has fairly reasonable access to the spare caliber 50 barrels, which are mounted on the rack on the left side of the turret. So I come over to the loader side, and this is unfortunately where ergonomics start to fail. Yes, I'm 6'5", that's 1.98 m to Europeans. And I'm a bit tall for a tanker in general, but this is one of the more cramped loading positions in any American vehicle I've ever been in. If I stand with my feet on the turret floor, the roof of the turret is about here on me. And even as I am sitting down on the seat, I have to crouch down to avoid hitting my head against the turret roof. So even the shorter tankers of the time, a lot of them probably still being a little bit cramped in here. Now, part of the reason that they have less space is that they have actually installed, again, a turret basket with a floor. If you recall, initially the M4s had full turret baskets, then it had partial baskets, and by the time we got to the M26, M46, there was no turret floor at all for the loader. I mean, he's basically trying to avoid getting his legs chopped off as the turret turns. So in this case, he is safe from that hazard. The downside is that he is quite cramped. Ammunition, he has 11 ready rounds in vertical stowage, 2 of which are just next to the commander. He also has the 4 semi-ready above the radio, and there's an additional round near him at the bottom right corner of the bustle. Of course, he probably will have an additional 12th round in the tube. Grand tally, 71 rounds stowed around the vehicle. So the others you can barely see perhaps through the whole basket. You can see rounds horizontally stowed in the hull sides. The platform beneath me is hinged and come up out of the way. Ammunition specially developed for the M36. The gun will fire the range of ammunition from the earlier M3 90mm. But obviously the earlier M3 will not fire the later ammunition, such as the T33 AP rounds of the M36 cannon. The rounds themselves are secured in place by a locking mechanism. You pull out, up, it releases the round, which you can then, in theory, pull out. I don't think this round has moved in years. So, it should be stuck in place, would you believe? But again, because it's so cramped in here, you get the round up. You can see how little room you have to put the round into place. And then you have to have the leverage and the sheer brute strength to shove this thing up and into the breech. I have to say, not the easiest loading vehicle I've ever been in. To his front, he has the coaxial machine gun, as I say, 30 caliber or caliber 50, usually caliber 30. The coax stowage bin is obviously wide enough to take the caliber 50 rounds. This is part of the linkage system, which goes from the gun elevation to the ballistic drive we saw earlier with the gunner seat. Now, one additional safety feature, which is handy for the loader, is to his right, he's got 2 interlocks. One of them will cut the hydraulic drive to the turret and to the gun elevation system. So the loader can actually work around in the hull under the platform without risk that the gunner or the TC might accidentally hit power, traverse around and remove one of his arms. Circuit breaker is very important. I actually have a scar on my hand, correction, my arm, from an ammo door that we failed to drop the circuit breaker from. Oops. The other interlock is simply the electronic firing switch. So if he has that set during the loading mechanism, the last thing he'll do is, once he is clear out of the way, and in fairness, there is a shield here for my knee, so I should be okay from the recoil. Flip the electronic interlock, gun is ready to fire, and so the gunner can now service the target with the electrical trigger. It doesn't, of course, do anything with the manual trigger. Last thing I have over here is the shutter controls. The protective shutters on the blisters for the rangefinder can be opened or closed by use of this. Dome light above. Well, that's it for the turret, and now we move forward. So move forward to the front of the vehicle in the driver's hole, and I've been in better. It's a little bit crowded. The seat does elevate, and the press is currently in the lower position right now. The first thing to notice, though, is it seems very roomy. The reason is that there's basically nothing in front of you, no controls, no dash or anything like that. They have taken a little bit of pains for crew comfort. There's padding for my left shoulder. There's padding around the hatch rim. The accelerator has a sort of a socket for your foot, so your foot's not going to slide off. Left foot, however, it's kind of lying a little bit loose. You rest your heel on the escape hatch, and the high beam, low beam toggle, if you recall, on very old cars, is down by your feet, and such is the case here. There are two pedals, the service brake and the accelerator. In order to hit the service brake, you've really got to pull your leg back off the accelerator over and then forward again. So the reason that there's no control to your front is that steering and direction is controlled by the wobble stick. It has an official name, but everybody knows it as the wobble stick. Think of it as a side stick controller, maybe a bit like an F-16. By moving it forwards and backwards, it controls the gear. So all the way forward is neutral. You cannot move the stick to the left or right in neutral unless you push in on the palm switch, at which point you can then move left or right. In neutral, the vehicle will, oddly enough, neutral steer. So I'm going to go off one of my little tangents now about neutral steer. Historically, neutral steer is so called because you were in neutral gear. However, these days the term is being used interchangeably with the phrase pivot steer. This isn't actually really correct. A pivot steer is when you lock one track and the other track pivots around it. The problem has been modern gears. If you look at say FM 2160, written back in the days when you still had M113s and M60s, the hand-arm signal for neutral steer was something like this. And if you look at the label, that actually says neutral steer. You look at an Abrams tanker today, though, and he's going to be a little bit confused because he will notice pivot steer. The problem was that with the newer gearboxes as found on, let's say, Abrams and Bradley, you actually had to select a different position on the gear shift for a neutral steer capability, an on-the-spot steer. And since neutral had already been taken by neutral gear, no gear at all, they had to come up with a new name for it, so they called it P for pivot steer. So these days, if you want to spin a tank on its axis, an Abrams for example, you got to go to pivot. As a result, generations of American tankers now have grown up thinking that neutral steer is actually pivot steer and don't know what a pivot steer really is. You can make an argument that it's incorrect, you can make an argument that it's a change of language. So the other gears, push in the palm switch, come back. The first one is going to be low range, high range, and then all the way back again you need the palm switch is reverse. Steering, of course, left, right, easy enough. Other controls or features in here. Down low by his right seat is the hand throttle. It's basically directly linked to the foot throttle, aka accelerator. You can also see the 3 fire extinguisher bottles, which are in the driver's compartment. The nearest one is a handheld, and the other 2 fixed ones are controlled by use of the 2 shots up near the turret roof. or the ones on the engine deck. Further forward and down is a large lever for the parking brake. It's basically you depress with your foot the service brake all the way, then it's a simple latch. It just locks the pedal in place. Forward of that, he has his instrument cluster. Speedometer, tachometer, light switch. It's easy enough to go to blackout markers, but in order to go to one of the service drives, you have to release a safety lock before you can move it on to a full headlight. And this just stops you accidentally illuminating yourself and the world in the middle of a battle. The design hasn't changed in donkey's years. Further down, fuel tanks, left fuel tank, right fuel tank, and the master relay switch. Further off to the right, we have the controls for the engine, magneto up top, boost bottom left, and the starter to the right. The button in the middle is the fuel cutoff. So that's how you stop the engine, simply you hit the fuel cutoff. Down at the bottom, you have the primer for the fuel pumps. The electrical fuel pumps are one for left tanks, one for right tanks, are in the middle of the compartment. Driver does have his own escape hatch. Obvious reason, if the turret is traversed the wrong way, he's not going to be able to get out the hatch. And with the full turret basket, it's also possible that he may not be able to egress through the turret either. So it's always nice to have a second route of escape. The escape hatch is obviously between the driver's legs. Simply pull up on this handle and the escape hatch will fall down to the ground. I mean, compared to some escape hatches that I've seen, this one's actually a reasonable size. Interestingly enough, also, it's one of the problems with the Abrams, it doesn't have a belly hatch. If the tank is overturned, you've no way of getting out, really. In theory, they say, yeah, you can spin the hull, which is now in the air, so that the driver's compartment can be accessed and you can get out through the driver's hatch. In actuality, it's a lot simpler if you have a belly hatch. So the M60 used to have a belly hatch. In fact, all the American tanks up until the M60 did. More strength if you don't have one, so pros and cons to the whole thing. And in fairness, the amount of times that people have died because they couldn't get out of the tank is pretty low. It has happened, don't get me wrong. There have been people that the tank has been upside down, they've been stuck in it and drowned. But is it worth the loss of integrity? You can make arguments both ways. Other than that, there are stowage compartments for spare periscopes, night vision, it looks like infrared, later on as an option. This little item down here, that's the slave receptacle for jump starts, basically. Your battery's dead and you can't get your auxiliary motor running for whatever reason. There is always the backup, get another tank to help you. Well, that covers the driver's position, so now we're going to hop over, quite briefly, and you'll see why, to the assistant driver's position. Last position in the tank, front right of the hull, the assistant driver, which is rather oddly named because he has no driver's controls whatsoever. There's no control for direction, there's no brake or accelerator. The only way he can drive is by kicking the other guy out. So it seems that his position as assistant driver is either as a relief if the main driver gets fatigued, or just to keep him company for morale purposes. Of course, he can also be used for other duties, such as for maintenance or sentry duties, gopher, things like that. But the only control of note that he has is this control box here for the auxiliary motor. To his front, he does retain the bow machine gun. And again, you'll wonder about the utility of this thing, given that the only way that he can see out and aim is by use of tracer and the periscope. And he doesn't even have a radio to operate anymore now that he's moved to the turret. The only reason that I can find in the archives as to why the bow machine gun had any utility, especially late in the war, was in reference to stabilization systems. When on the move, if you didn't have a good, solid stabilization system for the coaxial machine gun, your most effective weapon system was actually the bow machine gun because it was kind of flexible and reasonably capable as you're moving. In addition to the caliber 30 machine gun to his front, he also has stowage for the ammunition boxes just to his left. Outside of that, there's really nothing for the assistant driver to do. He's got lots of legroom, he has an escape hatch of his own, that's it. M47 was never really the tank the US Army wanted, but because of the tank panic, 8,576 of the things were built between July 51 and November 53. However, the work on the T-48 medium tank project was coming along fairly well. That had started in late 1950. That was a tank that the US Army actually was far more interested in, so that entered production as the M48 as soon as possible. As a result, the Army was left with a large number of quite serviceable, low-mileage tanks that it didn't really need anymore. As a result, a lot of those found their way to service of foreign countries as military aid, either in combat units or as movie stars. A lot of them were painted up with iron crosses on the side and made to look like tigers. Back then, standards were a bit different for movies. It did see upgrades over time. In its ultimate form, the 90mm was replaced by a 105, the petrol engine was replaced by a diesel, and the bow gunner was deleted and replaced by ammunition. That about covers it for the M47 tour here. If you have any further questions, please reference TM9-718A on the web, or see your local Detroit Arsenal or Alco dealer. See you at the next one.